I'm Steve Flannery. I'm with the South Dakota Hall of Fame. I'm a member of the board of directors, and today I'm with Paul Gnirk, who will be inducted this evening in the Hall of Fame, and his brother David. Paul lives in New Underwood. David's from Burke, South Dakota, and they grew up originally in Gregory County, which I'm very familiar with. And their mother, Adeline,
Yes.
was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1987. And her son, when he gets inducted tonight, might be the first mother-son combination in the South Dakota Hall of Fame. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would like to, I'd love to hear the story of your mother and your parents, and the fact that you're still on the original farm. So, would one of you kind of walk me through? They came from Minnesota, as I recall.
My grandparents came horse with the old covered wagon out of Nebraska. In 1905 with a brother-in-law, and homesteaded where we actually live now. There's actually now 5 generations on the ranch. My mother had a desire to start writing after high school and married my dad. Started writing before then and then stopped to take care of Paul and the rest of the family. And in 1970, I went off to the School of Mines, and she really began writing at that point in time in 1970 to do history of the local people who settled and who are still in Gregory County, and began that process, and then went to do also all the folks in Charles County. 2 counties, and up until approximately 1997, right in there. So she did it from 70 to 97. This history has numerous books, in-depth history, and really became known in our area as the book lady to this day.
In my understanding, she did 7 volumes, approximately.
Of at least 7, and then she did other histories for other folks
and
also.
had volumes of photographs, historical photographs as well.
See, one of the key features of the books were that she was able to get the history of the people that came from overseas and put in the pictures of them when their families from overseas, the original people before they came to the United States. So if you had a name like a Swedish name, with an S-O-N-N, you could look that up, and you could look back in time to the original Larson, Sweden, where they are back in Sweden, and who they were and when they came to the United States. It was a complete history of all the people.
And your parents and grandparents, were they Norwegian?
My mother was Norwegian.
Your mother was
My
Norwegian.
dad was actually German and French.
German and French.
My grandfather was German. My grandmother was French.
Okay.
And they met in Norfolk, or Battle Creek, actually, in Nebraska. He actually came out of Germany when he was 3 years old to Wausau, Wisconsin, with a sister, then ultimately came out, because his dad came out too, in and around Norfolk. And then in 1905, they came up to Bone Steel, which was at that time when they had the drawings. Took a drawing, actually a relinquishment, came out with a horse and buggy with his brother-in-law and dad, and then came back in September, which about this point in time, back to this ranch. And the interesting thing for the ranch, he settled on an area where there was the only water in the whole area. So that's really why we have survived all these years. We had water. So they became an area where people would come in during the day and get water. Back to their ranches and went on.
That we take so for granted.
Right, yeah.
So my mother's parents were immigrants from Norway.
They were from Norway, okay.
They came over in the early 1900s also, and eventually ended up in Burke for a period of time, and that's where my mother went to high school, her and her sister in Burke.
And your mother, she really, and like you mentioned, she didn't start writing until way late in her life, right? And put in all, really got into it.
It just became her life. I mean, I can remember we lived within a couple blocks of their home, and we'd go there in the morning, and her and my dad would be sitting at the kitchen table, and here would be all these manuscripts that she'd be writing up about you and the family. And we'd sit and start talking about you and the family and all the history of what was there. And there were those dark secrets that maybe someone was born out of wedlock and that. My mother wouldn't want to put them in there. And I said, you really need to, because that's history. No, well, after she passed, a lot of people still call us because they were children who were born out of wedlock and they were trying to find their history. And some of that, Paul and I were still aware of. But
One of the key features of all this, my father went along with my mother-in-law and they taped these. My father was a really outgoing individual, and he could get these people talking about their family and all that. And my mother took notes and they taped it. And Elaine, David's wife, has all these tapes.
Oh my gosh. And so a lot of these relatives, do you have some singular moments? Were these relatives that lived in the Burke area too?
But these weren't relatives. These were just the people. They weren't relatives.
Oh, it was.
They were
the locals.
the local people throughout the county. And she wrote books of different sections of the counties. Yeah. She might take, like, maybe there's 50 families, and she went to each one of them 2 to 3 times.
Well, I noticed she did like the Sully Flats.
And that's where we live. She went to, and she would go to you and interview you, go home and write it up, come back, and you would then say yes or no. And then she would go to the local newspaper in Gregory, and she'd sit down and type it all on the linotype and make all of these pages, then take them home and reread all those, and then she would and they would be printed. She would then take a page out and reread to make sure that there were no mistakes. Then she'd take the whole thing over to the South Dakota Penitentiary and go in, and at the penitentiary they would bind them all.
That's right.
And then she'd come out with approximately 5,000 to 10,000 copies, and then she'd give away 1,000 copies.
That's right.
Totally give away 1,000.
At her own expense.
Right, and I always questioned why, and she said, you go out and plant a crop of corn, and what do you get? You get a bounty. She said, this is going to be my seeds that I'm planting so that ultimately you boys will have bounty when these people all come, and that's what has happened.
And do both of you have copies of these books?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All the family members have copies?
Oh, yeah. Well, oh, yeah. And we have, when we left home yesterday, there were people who called who needed a copy of one of the areas, and that's a very common occurrence that my wife gets, because she's become, quote, the book lady.
Okay.
My mother's name was called the book lady, and so there are actually letters that come to Burke, South Dakota that said the Burke lady, Burke, South Dakota.
Oh gosh.
And they hand them to my wife, or telephone calls that'll come, and they know then that my wife now is the book lady.
Is there a Gregory County Historical Museum?
Not in Dallas. There is.
In Dallas there is.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So there's a place that these are also.
I would guess so. They're at all the universities. They're in the United States, in the Library of Congress. There's a whole set.
A lot of museums and a lot of
museums.
libraries, and they're in the Dallas Library, Dallas Museum, in the Carnegie Building.
Yeah.
And were both of you at her induction into the Hall of Fame?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
God, that's remarkable.
The induction was done by Governor Mickelson.
It was. Okay.
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah.
Was that in Pier?
Yeah, it was in
It
Pier.
was in Pier.
At Ramcota, or else at the.
I think it was the Ramcota. It's interesting at that time. We all had our own busy lives, and my mother had, achieved these things. She's also had many other awards through other universities and throughout many of them. And we think back at that time, really the significance of what it was, and it's even become more so now that my brother here is also inducted into that, a family thing. My mother, in her own way, set her own course, and along with my brother, that will go on beyond her death and all our deaths.
Did your mother have an influence on both of you going to the school of mines? And how did that all happen?
My grandparents told me when I was very young that I was going to go to college, and my grandfather said, that education was the key to success in America, And I eventually, in my last year in high school, decided to go to the school of mines. And 3 years later, my next brother came, and 3 years later, another brother came, and then David was the last one.
Yeah. Well, I think my mother, my dad especially, knew that education was very important. Because I wanted to ranch, and he said, no, you're not. You're going to go to college for 4 years. You got to get away and do something different. And they really valued education.
And what did you get your engineering degree in?
Mechanical engineering.
Mechanical. And you got mining, your
And
undergrad.
mechanical later
And
on.
mechanical later on, right.
Yeah.
And that's a great, and your other two brothers?
Robert is a mechanical engineer, and Donald was a mathematician and ended up teaching at South Dakota State University
South Dakota State, okay.
in mathematics.
Mathematics. Yes.
So, in winding this up, what is the, I'd like to hear from each one, give me one good impression of your mother that really stands out in your mind.
Adeline. Well, there's many things. A kind, caring individual, really cared for her sons, who was one who valued her sons above anything, but also looked at, she said, I want to take the history of all these people, and the world needs to know about
Tell
what
their story.
tell their story. And really that was her biggest passion. I want to do this. I want this to carry on so that these people will be known beyond the time that they would pass away.
David, did she kind of create an extra interest in history in your mind too? Did you kind of follow
yes.
her
Yes,
in
yes.
your love for history? And
Oh yeah, and a lot of it came from people would come to me with questions about people, and her books became a centerpiece. If we were at another ranch and we started talking history, they would go get the book, and the book was one of Mother's book and bring it, and that became a centerpiece always.
how about
So
you?
she was, both my parents, Freddie and Adeline, were very well known in the community, very well involved. And when I was working overseas, I'd send cards back to them, and I'd address it to Freddie and Adeline. That's all I put down. Gnirk, South Dakota, USA.
Yeah.
And they always got it.
Small community.
Well, and
Yeah.
I was mentioned to David before we started this that my first, in 1980, I started selling equipment, and it was Gregory County was my first, and Burke, South Dakota at the courthouse, and
yeah.
Joe Engelmeyer
Yeah,
and a lot of people that you
County
guys,
commissioners.
and the Littlebridge boys, and I just got to know everybody. I made it my business to get to know them, and there's one thing about Gregory County is it's an independent sort of place. There are a lot of self-made people.
Different, but I think the Dirty 30s really shaped a lot of the
Yeah,
people.
absolutely.
Those who made it, and then what came of it. And you have various people, the Littlebridges, who were part of it. You had prominent people who were really part that helped it to grow. My parents were, very integral in many ways throughout to shape the county, really.
Absolutely.
The Fernbacher ran the newspaper.
Yeah.
Gunverdal was a little the person involved. Gunverdal graduated my mother in high school in Burke.
They had the law business.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, last week I was in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art, and I came along, and there's a film playing by Oscar Micheaux. And he was an African American that lived in Gregory, South Dakota in the 20s and did films. And there were many people standing around me. I said, that gentleman's from Gregory, South Dakota, and they go, how do you know that? Well, I knew he was. So, well, thank you, gentlemen. It's fun to hear about your mother and your family, and congratulations on
Thank you.
your induction in the Hall of Fame.
Appreciate it.